So let's take a look at which armies in Warhammer 40k are strongest right now and what they're using to do well on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a focused look at the top end of the Warhammer 40k power spectrum, going through the top 10 Warhammer 40k armies in terms of win rate, looking through a few other stats for them, and talking about which detachments and units that they're using the most to get those victories. For army data, there's a few ways to assess faction strength in Warhammer 40k. I usually do like to go through in terms of tournament win rate at grand tournaments. It's definitely not the only stat that matters, though I think it does give a nice rough and ready metric for overall army power levels, and perhaps more so it's the more meaningful number for the average player there, more than for the select few that are realistically seeking to top grand tournaments. I'll go through in that order, but also add in a few counterpoints as well. The faction play rate at big tournaments, which tends to be a bit overinflated for the armies doing well and shows some general enthusiasm to take them to competitive events, and also some placings at the absolute tops of events, armies that have gone 5 games undefeated, so basically have either won grand tournaments or have done a performance that would have been the equivalent of doing so elsewhere. Most of these stats come from the data that I've gathered over the past few weeks, manually going through Best Coast pairings and the other places that track tournaments. There's plenty of other places that track Warhammer 40k stats though. Stats Hotbar and StatCheck 40k have a ton of cool things and also showcase some detachment performance, and Goonhammer get a whole bunch of casual game data via their own app. And it's interesting to take a look at the win rates on that relative to the competitive game as another data point to assess the strength of armies. Broadly though, as Warhammer 40k goes, I feel like faction balance really isn't too bad at the moment, and certainly quite a lot better than the Death Guard and Knight meta that we just left behind. Pretty much every faction can be a force to be reckoned with a good player and a good list played well. Though as ever, there do tend to be armies that have it a little easier, winning more games or making it all the way to the top, and it's still interesting to take a look at what's putting them ahead. First up, there's a whole bunch of armies clustered in the sort of mid-tier of Warhammer 40k. These ones just out of the top 10 by win rates, but clustered around the 50% win rate sort of marker, at least so far since the balance pass. There's a couple here that only just missed out on being in the top 10, with the Chaos Demons and Death Guard both on 51%. They're both very solid upper mid-tier factions, and I feel like with things so finely balanced, there's a bit of luck as to whether or not they would have made it into the top 10 if had done this on another week. And beyond them we have the Leagues of Votan, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Genestealer Cults, Chaos Knights, and Orcs. I thought for honourable mentions I might just talk about the Chaos Knights and the Space Marines that have win rates below this, just because they're having quite so much top table performance in big tournaments, even if their overall average win rates don't quite make them into the top 10. The Chaos Knights, as seen, have win rates around 49%, so dropping 4 compared with the previous meta. Goonhammer's more casual dataset has them a bit higher than that. Maybe not too unexpected, as Knight armies often tend to perform better in more casual metas than top tier competitive. That's not exactly the case for Chaos Knights at the moment though, as it just looks like a whole bunch of Chaos Knight armies are placing very high towards the tops of tournaments, with a huge 10 players going 5 games undefeated, which is one of the very highest ranking there, and not bad given a slightly middling play rate at 11th out of the 28 factions. For the last balance updates, the Chaos Knights have big nerfs to the Big Knights and the Carnivore, lots of points increases that seems to put them as a more mid-tier faction as opposed to stand out strong as they have been previously. And then the balance data slates doubled down with a few more nerfs. The Lords of Dread stratagem got toned down, the detachment roar of the Infernal Lance was toned down slightly on the defensive version, and if you have multiple Knight Abominants they now can't stack their mortal wounds. After the points increases and those changes, it looks like where there were previously both the Lords of Dread and Infernal Lance doing well, it now seems that the Infernal Lance has absolutely taken over as the competitive way to play them. That's the one that gives you extra damage or defense with lethal hits or sustained hits, or potentially make your knights move faster. They have an ignores cover stratagem and diabolic bulwark to make one knight extra hard to kill. That detachment rule does mean that Chaos Knight internal balance isn't great at the moment. Lots and lots of strong lists and running multiple copies of the dual Gatling Despoiler. That's just brutally murderous damage output with 36 strength 6 and damage 2 shots, which is great against infantry, and if you give it lethal hits then it gets great against tough stuff too. It's just very hard to go wrong with those crazy gun turret knights that can often win most firefights, and they tend to be supported by war dogs, usually the carnivores in preference, though often with a few stalkers with their scout move as well. And then many lists go heavy on the allied demons, Nurglings to get some battle line units and cheap infiltrators and deep strikers, and Beasts of Nurgle for some cheap scouts that can do actions. Plenty of the other bigger Chaos Knights are still very playable. The Rampager, Lancer, Abominant, Atropos, Desecrator and Tyrant. They all work, but do seem like they're solidly behind the dual Gatling Despoiler and Infernal Lance for sheer power. Seems like spam with that knight in particular is keeping them strong though. It doesn't really feel like it's the most healthy place of balance for the Chaos Knights though. It's not exactly the most interesting mix of knight builds where there were a few more prior to the points changes. Feels like for internal balance, maybe some of the other knights need to go down a tiny bit and that one needs to go up, or perhaps it might help not to have quite such crazy synergy with the Infernal Lance specifically for that one. In any case, Chaos Knights are still winning lots of tournaments. Otherwise, for the other honourable mention before the top 10, we've got the Space Marines. They've got lower win rates at grand tournaments of 47%, though even that's an improvement on the 44% they were before. Goonhammer's casual win rates have them about that sort of level as well, but they're both very popular at the moment, and they're also winning lots of tournaments, the most played faction in the game currently, which even with their popularity isn't always the case, which is good, though admittedly not quite as standout if you weight per play rate. The last balance changes had cheaper Redemptors, Land Raiders, Aggressors, and the Gladiator Valiant, but also pricier Guilliman, Ballistas, and Blade Guards. So there were some nerfs to staples, but at the same time they gained Aethon Sharn and the Shadow Mark Talon, making Raven Guard genuinely scary and viable. Space Marines are now split between Ultramarines lists and Raven Guard lists on the competitive scene, it would seem. Shadow Mark Talon is just pretty great, having everything that the Vanguard Task Force had pretty much, but also being able to use the Return to Reserves for free, which is brilliant, and also gaining Hunter's Instincts for first turn rapid ingress for a scary unit is a really massive deal. Otherwise for Ultramarines lists, most use Gladius, though some have good success with Stormlance at the top level, often Guilliman or Calgar or both leading the way there. Shadow Mark Talon lists tend to go heavy on the Centurions and Inceptors, which really love the redeploy, and 2 sets of Vanguard veterans, one with Strike and one potentially rapid ingressing with Hunter's Instincts. Then Space Marines have got a good mix of objective support units, Scouts, Infiltrators, Intercessors, Incursors, Jump Intercessors, and the Combi Lieutenant, all filling out different roles and can skirmish well with the enemy at the same time. And they're often backed up by a bit of heavy firepower, maybe some Dranks or Dreadnoughts. It's cool to see a few more people using Redemptors with the boosted Oath of Moment again. Overall, Space Marines aren't having too bad a time of it at the moment. Often the main issue for them, though, is that there's a big disparity between the average player's Space Marine list and a fully optimised one. They've just got a vast unit pool, and one player's collection might not resemble anything like the top competitive lists. It's still not quite as well balanced for the other chapters besides Ultramarines and Raven Guard. It will be quite nice to see them actually address the Shadow Mark and boosted Oath of Moment question, where the intent seems kind of obvious, but Games Workshop's FAQ is causing some consternation and implying that they don't get it at the moment. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold, one option for magnetic carry cases for Warhammer 40K and transporting miniatures from A to B. Magnetic storage now seems to have risen to be the single most popular way to get Warhammer models to the field in safety, the idea being to attach magnets to the bottom of your bases. They can sit on metal trays within a case, and it means that you can have lots of miniatures all next to each other and stored in really quite a small volume of space without the danger of them damaging each other or needing bulky foam. Tabletop Stronghold's take on these is basically a super sturdy MDF box, really quite notably hard to break or damage, and then within that box there's a whole bunch of steel trays that can be raised or lowered to different levels, and you set the height depending on the height of the miniatures that you're transporting. They can slide in and out to get the models off them, and on the front goes an acrylic sheet to protect the minis, but also allow you to see what's where, which is nice. Broadly speaking, reviews I've seen of them tend to be pretty positive. I've seen them handle customer service things in the past pretty well too. As well as the mag cases, they also have a terrain offering as well. If you're in the market for some MDF terrain, that comes a little cheaper if you pick it up at the same time as a mag case. I'll leave them linked in the video description below though if you'd like to check out their stuff. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one, and I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video for a few of their designs if you're interested. Honourable mentions aside, let's get into the top 10 proper. In 10th place we have the Necrons, win rates in 52% so far this balance pass, but that's a bit higher than the casual win rates that Goonhammer seem to have at 47. They do seem to be doing well by the other metrics though, quite a lot of people choosing to put them on the tabletop right now. 5th most played out of the 28 armies, and have taken 6 high placing spots at tournaments with those 5 game undefeated runs. The Necrons had very small balance changes last time around. The Silent King dropped down 20 points, though he had his abilities shifted for a movement buff rather than ignores modifiers. Overall, it seems pretty similar in terms of value. It doesn't feel like he got weaker given the points cut and he was strong before. The Triad Praetorian change maybe being a little bit more niche, though I have since seen them used in top placing armies. For most competitive detachments, most people choose either the Starshatter Arsenal or the Awakens Dynasty. Starshatter gives you damage boosts against enemy units on objectives, plus some good support from the Silent King Doomsday Arcs and other vehicles. They can have a Catacomb Command Barge with some reroll 1s to hit and wounds, and make the Silent King incredibly hard to kill with a -1 damage. Otherwise it's the Awakened Dynasty, that's the character focused one with +1 to hit for character led units. They've got good stratagems including reactive reanimation and some damage dealers, and in particular reviving characters from death is a really big deal. Necrons broadly feel like they're in quite a good spot overall, a couple of viable ways to play, and then the vast majority of their units being fairly solid. Maybe some of their bigger staples, Technomancers and Wraiths, are hard to go wrong with such a durable unit to scrap on the front line. They're good in both of those detachments. They've got good objective support between Flayed Ones, Ophidian Destroyers, Hexmarks and Lone Locusts, and plenty of other choices for objective skirmishers. Scorpet Destroyers with a Lord in Awakened Dynasty, Orokin-led Warriors can be a pain to take down. Doomsday Arcs have some seriously heavy firepower, and the Locust Heavies are quite nice as well. The Silent Kings good in all detachments, though particularly in Star Shatter, and Catan Shards of the Nightbringer or Void Dragon can be a nice slow-moving durability stat check of a unit. Lots of other good stuff though. Can Opset Reanimators for boosting double reanimation moves, and Imitate the Stormlord, rustling up command points for the good stratagems that detachments have. Overall feels like they're doing pretty well. For any army issues, they can be a little slow and ponderous, and some of their units pay for durability by having less damage. For internal faction balance, it might be nice to see a bit more focus on things like Immortals, Warriors and Lich Guard plus their support. All three are maybe feeling a bit more niche when they feel like they should be the heart of the army really. And it wouldn't hurt to have a few more of the detachments a little more playable, even if some of the others are usable. They just don't feel quite on the same level as these two. Overall, really not in the worst place though. Next up, we've got the Zealous Crusading Space Marines that are the Black Templars. Their win rates are around 52% at Grand Tournaments, which has risen a bit since the balance pass. That seems to be fairly similar for Goonhammer's more casual game dataset, and have taken a fair amount of top spots at big tournaments, despite having a slightly low competitive play rate at around 16th out of the 28 armies, which is a bit higher than normal for them. They've had a recent codex, and they haven't had any real changes outside of core codex Space Marines. They did have the change to the bigger squad of Blade Guard, which is fairly relevant, and that perhaps further cemented Sword Brethren being the main choice over them. When they take to the field in tournaments, most people are using the Gladius Task Force for them. The codex detachments just were weirdly restrictive, and only giving buffs to certain units with keywords, whether they're transports, chaplains, or ancients. I'm not sure why Games Workshop thought it would be a good idea not to give the Black Templars a general purpose fighting melee detachment. Gladius does a good job to support them though. Advance and charge for them is really quite big. Fights on Death is nice to access, and the other support is generally handy with reactive moves and things. A few people have been trying out the codex ones, though generally not to too much success. For standout units, people are using multiple squads of 4 or 5 man Sword Brethren with a Marshal and Castellan attached. That gives you rerolls and auto wounds with a whole bunch of lethal hits on a 5+. Some squads of them use Helbrechts along for the ride instead of a Marshal, who's got some good numbers as well. And while they are overshadowing Crusader squads, they aren't completely useless, either for a big squad surge move style thing, or having some fairly similar hitting power, but a bit more survivability than the Sword Brethren. Lots of lists are going for some small units of Assault Intercessors, either with the Emperor's Champion or possibly Grimaldus. The Emperor's Champion often quite enjoying the Honour Vehement enhancement in the Gladius Task Force. He's very fighty with Assault Intercessor rerolls built into him. The Templar Repulsor Executioner basically outshines the rest of the Space Marine fire support choices, so there's very commonly at least 2 of them in fire support with their built-in rerolls and free multi-melters. The Templar Impulsor can be another good choice to deliver Sword Brethren or Emperor's Champion squads, and then add in a good bunch of the generic Space Marine support units, somewhere between Scouts, Jump Intercessors, Regular Intercessors, and the Combi Lieutenant. Overall, they're looking like they're in a pretty solidly scary place with a bunch of dangerous melee units and some good fire support. I say perhaps for their biggest army issues, they need a detachment that's themed more for them and is not quite as restrictive as their Codex ones were. It'd be nice to see Crusader squads be a little bit more focal, and they do have some data sheets that are rather niche, particularly that Ancient. I feel like for being unusually powerful though, I'd be absolutely surprised if the Repulsor Executioner didn't get nerfed at the next balance pass too. Next up, and in 8th place, we have the Adeptus Custodes, also on 52% wins, so have gained +4 since the balance pass. That seems the same as the casual win rates from Goonhammer. They're pretty popular on the tournament tables, being played the 7th most out of the 28 armies, though as per normal not really doing quite so well on the top tables, only 2 armies having taken those high placings there. And as with the Knights, often tended to do better at the sort of casual or RTT style level, as opposed to the absolute top tables of big events. Their last balance changes had some pretty useful ones for them. Cheaper Custodian Guard by a few points was quite a big one. Their Land Raiders and Shield Captain went down, as did some of the bigger Sisters squads. It still seems that the Lines of the Emperor is very much the way to play Custodes currently. A big +1 to wound for squads fighting in isolation, some good stratagems for supporting units scrapping in the midboard, and some nice powerful enhancements for the Shield Captains. The other most played ones are the Solar Spearhead and the Shield Host, and it seems that the people going for those do have some good success as well. The Custodes don't have a huge roster of units, but it looks like the vast majority of their stuff is doing pretty well. Probably the most notable change is that Custodian Guard now actually seem to be rivaling Wardens rather well again. It seems there's about even numbers of play rates between the Custodian Guard and Wardens in lists. That is quite fun to see, and some of them still are good with Kyria Draxus, with her shooting and range debuff. Wardens with Blade Champions are still rather tried and tested. Trajan Valoris can be a good choice to go with them as well, particularly using his Moment Shackle twice in Lines of the Emperor. Then beyond that, Allarus Custodians are pretty solid, and maybe more so in Lines of the Emperor with the ability to split the unit if you want a lot of small, deep striking units. The Jetbag and Terminator Shield Captains do well there. The Fast Attack Virtus Praetors and Forge World Venatari are both solid. Something like 3 or so Sisters of Silence units are quite nice to screen and score. Some could use a Calidus Assassin to bounce around the board for that purpose too. And Caladius tanks are quite nice fire support, good anti-tank purposes, and they can deal damage without getting too close to other Custodes units while they're getting that +1 to wound in the mid-board for the Lions. Overall, the Custodes feel like they've got a pretty solid army on the go at the moment. I guess for any downsides, they often tend to be a somewhat predictable stat check style army. Maybe a bit at the mercy, both on the positive and negative, of their 4+ invulnerable saves, and if they make loads of those, then they could have a very good time. But if they fail lots, it's not going to work out so well. Obviously, that doesn't exactly make them easy to overcome though, even if they don't take the top table placings quite as much as some. Next up, and placing in 7th, we have the Tau Empire, also with a 52% win rate. That's jumped up really quite a big amount since the last balance pass, with a few buffs to their army, plus a few nerfs to the other top things. They're doing well at taking placings at the tops of tournaments with 7 on the go there, and do seem to be rising slightly in the amount of play rates they have. They're 10th out of the 28 factions currently, and that was a fair bit worse prior to the balance pass. For the main changes they had last time, the Fire Knife and Sunforged Crisis suits dropped down 10 points, Broadsides had a decrease and Farsight is cheaper, and the Riptide got a surprisingly generous strength 10 on the Iron Accelerator without a points rise, making it certainly one of the single strongest units in the codex, and it was already good before. It's really quite common to see lists running 3 of them now. Again, Tau seem to be in a pretty good spot overall. Both their detachments and their units are rather well balanced. Literally every single one of their detachments sees a reasonable amount of competitive play, and you can't really say that about any other army. And most of them do have at least some good arguments to being fairly strong as well. Probably the experimental prototype cadre is the only one that really stands out as being a bit weaker, even if people enjoy that one. Besides Riptide, stealth suits are still feeling rather mandatory in terms of their fire support rule. Tau have got some good objective skirmishers, pathfinders, Kroot carnivores for sticky objectives, and Vespers jumping on and off the board. Having a few rushing piranhas isn't the worst idea in the world either, or some of the cheaper Kroot units. For more dedicated anti-tank, the Hammerheads, Broadsides and Skyrays are all good. You could have Ghost Kills hovering around in the backfield for a mix of fire support and utility. The buffs do genuinely seem to have an impact on the amount of play of the Fire Knife and the Sunforged Crisis suits. They're seeing a lot more regular play in lists than before the points drop, maybe not quite so much for Farsight. Devilfish with breaches in them are still very solid, particularly so in Experimental, Kauyon or Monkar, and the Kroot units get excess value in their own detachments, and certainly the Krootox Rampagers with some big stat lines. They're rather excellent in the Kroot Hunting Pack, though also good in the Auxiliary cadre. Overall, not too much to say negative about Tau at the moment. Their faction internal balance is pretty great, and nice to see the Kroots more or less functioning rather well as their own army. They can sometimes be a slightly harder army to command, and particularly so at more casual levels, presuming there's good terrain and places for enemies to hide. And I would say that currently Riptides are perhaps a little bit of an obvious way to go currently. I wouldn't really be too surprised if they go up a few points to pay for their new Iron Accelerators, though likely wouldn't have to be too much. Next up, and placing in 6th, we have the World Eaters. They're also on 52% wins, again having risen up a little bit since post-update. That seems to be the same for their casual games, and it's interesting to see that they've absolutely exploded in popularity after the last balance passes. They've risen up to be briefly the most played army in Warhammer 40k, then dropping back and beaten out by the Space Marines, dropped down to 2nd. And that is basically the highest play rate the World Eaters have ever had since Games Workshop released them as their own faction. Interestingly though, at least so far, they don't seem to have been taking quite so many top table victories, having just 4 of those 5-game undefeated runs at the start of tournaments, and that's actually quite low numbers given just how many people are playing them. It might be an element of bad luck though, there are tons of people managing to go 4-1 with them. The last balance changes did have some nerfs as well as buffs. They had Pricious Spawn, Khan the Betrayer and Forge Fiends, all of which were staples and still are really. But on the flip side, they got cheaper 8-bound, Angron and Terminators. The Exalted 8-bound got cheaper but also got vastly more dangerous against vehicles, getting damage 3 against monster and vehicle datasheets. While the Tau have a lot of detachments viable, the World Eaters basically just have the one now. Basically everyone uses the Berserker Warband, +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge is hard to go too far wrong with. They've got some good stratagems for supporting melee, and nice sticky objectives on Death 1 and some good ones for Berserkers in particular. and then 4 very usable enhancements that often crop up in competitive lists. After a fair few balance passes, the majority of units in the codex are at least usable, besides some of the gun tanks that get a bit neglected. For objective support, multiple units of spawn tend to be a staple, rushing up the board with their very fast scout moves and advance and charge. They can be nice for the sticky objectives on death. Jackals can do that while they're still alive. A Goremonger unit can be nice enough to pay a premium for some infiltrating and guarantee you get your scout moves where they want to be. For the more damage dealer units, Khorne Berserkers seem to have really taken off in a big way since the balance update, and that is kind of interesting given that the 8-bound were the ones that got the big points cuts. One squad of 10 in a Rhino with Khan the Betrayer is no auto-include, though now there's plenty of people using them in big squads of 20 as well, often with a Juggernaut Lord, perhaps with the Battle Lust enhancements to get them into battle, surging across the board and threatening to just outright delete multiple squads at once, and then being a pain to gun down afterwards, as they might just jump into melee. A Demon Prince with a Helm of Ire can give out some discounted stratagems and is hard to take down. Forge Fiends and Hellbrutes are both strong in their own way. With their cheaper points costs, both varieties of 8-bound are intensely dangerous, both well capable of absolutely demolishing units they get into and generally fielded in 3s. They're often accompanied by a Slaughterbound with the Berserker Glaive enhancement, who again for the points cost on his big go turn and all the other stats buffs that you can put on him is just immensely fighting. Overall seems like a good time for the World Eaters, quite nice to have a good focus both on the Khorne Berserkers and the 8-bound a bit more than they were before. For any criticisms, I guess the detachment balance is quite a big one, plus there are still a number of units that just don't really see play. Angron's kind of unfortunate to be a bit weak, and other things like Lord Invocators, the Terminators and Lord of Skulls are kind of rarely seen. They seem popular at the moment though, and are doing rather well. Next up by the win rate numbers, we've got the Grey Knights, who I do kind of wonder whether or not they're here partly due to an element of chance and having a good start. They had a very good performance in the first couple of weeks, and wouldn't be too surprised if with a bit more data they tend to be headed a bit further down to the sort of 50% win mark or below it. In any case though, with the numbers that we have so far, they're on 53% wins, which is pretty strong for the Knights of Titan. That's just a little above Goonhammer's more casual game dataset at 51. They are one of the lesser played factions of Warhammer 40K at 23rd out of the 28 armies. I've just had the 2 tournament with 5 games undefeated, and that's not particularly stand out there, even accounting for low play rates. They were both at quite big notable events though. Like the Black Templars, they didn't really get all that many big balance changes. They just had some cheaper Land Raiders to go alongside the core Codex Space Marine ones. Before the balance pass, they weren't really doing quite as well as the Black Templars were though. For the detachments, the majority of people are playing Warpbane Task Force, so the Grotmus Purifier one that they had pre-Codex. It's nice with its damage rerolls, which help out most of the army, and in particular Dread Knight firepower. And then the focus on Purifiers is quite a strong thing as well, given that they're one of the more threatening data sheets in the Codex. Lots of danger at range and melee, and big inbuilt rerolls for full rerolls to wound against things on objectives. It seems to have the best win rates overall, and then the second most played after that are the Banishers. They seem to be having fairly comparable top level success, but in terms of overall win rates, the Warpbane Task Force is quite a long way ahead. For their standout units, there's often 3 or more Dread Knight bodies for taking down tough stuff. The majority of the army just doesn't really do so well against tanks and vehicles, so in particular it tends to be the Grandmaster Nemesis Dread Knight with Subliminator, Psy-Cannon and Hammer going in there. Particularly dangerous against them in close combat with the Nemesis Great Hammer, getting 4 rerolls to hit and wounds. Purifiers are great both with Crow and in smaller units as well. Some strikes and interceptors are good for utility. Some people go heavy on the interceptors, and sometimes either they or the purifiers can get supported by Razorbacks. They're rather cheap, have a heavy weapon, and a nice damage buff for extra AP for units getting out. A few people are using Paladins, they can do okay more in Banishers lists versus Warpbane. And for the HQ choices, the Brotherhood Librarian is perhaps the other standout one. A little bit of damage dealing, and they can just teleport in individually for a bit of a utility unit with some ranged shooting threat. Overall, feels like Grey Knights are in a bit of an unusual spot at the moment. Not doing particularly well before the balance updates, but apparently seem to be doing fairly well after, maybe due to the different armies that they're fighting. I feel like it maybe wasn't the greatest news for them when there were all the Knights stomping around everywhere, and only having limited units being able to deal with them. At the same time though, it doesn't look like there's a huge amount of enthusiasm to play the faction. Pretty small numbers of them taking them to grand tournaments, even given the faction's normal play rates, and as mentioned I really wouldn't be too surprised if their win rates drop a little bit with more data. Otherwise, for any broad issues for their army, their teleport tricks are very powerful but only help out so much, and don't necessarily always help melee units get where they need to be. Plus armies that can screen in a really big way can hurt them. Otherwise, for internal codex balance, feels like maybe a few of the other detachments could use help, and in particular the Terminator units could use a boost. Paladins seem to be somewhat viable, though not really at the centre of the army, and the Brotherhood Terminators seem to be fairly overshadowed. It'd be quite nice to have them a bit more front and foremost, and the Dread Knights perhaps be in a bit more of a supporting role. Next up, and doing all rather well at the moment, are the Sisters of Battle. The Adepta Sororitas having win rates around 54%, having risen up on the competitive scene a good 2 or 3% since the last balance update, though admittedly it does look like at a more casual level the Goonhammer numbers are a little bit lower there at 48. They certainly seem to have been leaving an impact on the competitive scene recently though. Still kind of lowish play numbers, which isn't too unusual for them, but managing to have a big 6 high placings, either tournament victories or 5-0 undefeated runs. The last balance changes didn't change things hugely for them. The main change was Retributors going from being a fairly bad unit to a pretty solid one. They got cheaper and their damage buff got really quite a lot better, stacking rather than replacing. And then some small points cuts to Celestine and Istrid and Agatha. For stronger options at the moment, most people play either Hallowed Martyrs or Champions of Faith. The Hallowed Martyrs having quite good support for melee sisters with its stratagems, plus in particular for characters being able to revive them from death. Excellent for more than Val or lone characters run solo, and they can really mess with melees, forcing the enemy to attack one unit and not attack your other one. Champions of Faith focus on the Sacrosanct and the Paragon Warsuits, both very good units. Quite a lot of raw power to those in that one, and then some people enjoy using the Bringers of Flame as well. It looks like that one might be possibly having a small resurgence in popularity now Retributors got better. It's still far weaker than it was at Codex launch though. Overall internal balance doesn't seem too bad for the sisters. For absolute staple units, Paragons and more than Val are hard to turn down, as are some Battle Sisters split with an Immolator for some cheap sticky objectives units and skirmishing. Castigators a nice general purpose firepower with the extra AP, and then the vast majority of the sisters elites are solidly usable now. Celestian Sacrosancts maybe with a Hospitaller. Dominions, Retributors and Seraphim, Arco-Flagellants for some mass melee muscle or small skirmishing squads, and maybe some Novitiates for the infiltrate role, or perhaps split with an Immolator. They've got plenty of good infantry characters too. Junitheritas nice for the command point generation, and feisty Canonesses and Palatines often crop up, perhaps in particular in the Hallowed Martyrs. Overall they can bring a whole bunch of damage, though their units generally tend to be fragile and maybe tend to be a bit player skill and terrain dependent as a result. Maybe quite often tending to be a faction that tends to be a bit better at the competitive level more so than casual. If able to coordinate their units to their targets and make the best use of miracle dice though, they're seriously scary. Next up and in third place we have the Aeldari. Their tournament win rates are around 55%, so have gained a bit on the previous update, and it looks like they're somewhat similar at a casual level as well. They're one of the most played factions in Warhammer 40k, 4 out of the 28 armies currently, only behind Space Marines, Death Guard and World Eaters. Though in terms of tournament victories and high placings with those 5-0 undefeated runs, they're the second highest faction here, with a big 12 results like that. They were already doing really quite well after the Death Guard and Knight nerfs pre-data slate. I was expecting that they'd probably get a few nerfs as a result, but Games Workshop didn't really do that. They got just a couple of tiny changes to small units of Corsair Void Reavers and big squads of Swooping Hawks. They actually got a few small buffs as well to the Avatar, Azerman, Dire Avengers and Wraithblades. I've seen at least a few people using Azerman with Dire Avengers as another move shoot move style unit as a result. For detachments, they generally use either the Aspect Host or War Host, both of which are doing rather great. They can both do the thing with fire dragons jumping out of a wave serpent and then jumping back in after they've annihilated something. It's pretty common to see Fugan and a unit of 10 running around doing that in either detachment. The War Host has the battle focus buffs, extra tokens, boosted effects, and some Aeldari movement shenanigans. Aspect Host having a damage dealer stratagem and some inbuilt rerolls, and a few other things. Most of the rest are less plays, maybe the Seer Council being the most consistently notable out of the others. Besides Fire Dragon formations, Dark Reapers also are used in lots of lists. Lycus and Jane Czar rushing up the board alongside their aspects to hit the enemy first, and then backed up by a good amount of objective grabbers, somewhere between Rangers, Storm Guardians, Void Reavers, and small units of Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders, which can do a good mix between objectives and a bit of damage. Eldred Ulthram might be in the backfield generating some command points. Some use Autarchs to go alongside their Dark Reapers or other units. Striking Scorpions are usable enough, and there are plenty more units that are solidly usable, though it does feel like Aeldari have the one main playstyle at the moment. Overall, certainly seems like they're doing really well. It would be nice to see some of their other builds do a bit better, maybe some mass jet bike armies or wraith hosts. They have a big roster and there's a whole ton of units that just don't really see regular competitive play. Their current builds generally might be a little weaker against anything that can hit fragile aspect warriors first, things like close range deep strikers or things that can rush super fast or indirect fire. I would guess that with this kind of performance though, they're probably going to be in line for nerfs at the next balance pass. Finally though, that leaves us with the two armies, both of which with more or less the same win rate at the moment. Just nosing into second place were the Deathwatch with 58% wins, an absolutely enormous increase on pre-update, going up by around about 12% or so. They're doing very similarly at more casual levels and have managed to win or place highly at 4 tournaments so far. With those initial 5-game undefeated runs, that's not crazy standout in its own right, but becomes very standout when you take into account how few people are playing the faction. They're the second least played faction in the game, with only the Imperial agents behind them. They have a tiny player base at the best of times, never mind Games Workshop's uncertain treatment of the faction in recent times. As people cotton on to Deathwatch being good this time around though, it does look like the numbers are going up very slightly, at least week on week. Having such a small number of players use them though does mean that there's a bit less certainty with their numbers overall, as there's just not really that much data to go on. It did seem pretty likely that they'd rise up in a big way after the last balance pass. They'd sort of got middling to lowish numbers, but got pretty big buffs essentially across their kill team range. Lots of kill teams went down 20 points, the Watchmaster dropped a bit, and then they had the Codex Space Marine changes, though they weren't really quite as impactful given they didn't tend to use those units quite so much. In competitive play, they basically near exclusively used their Blackspear detachment. They've got a good core rule with the mission tactics for some easy damage, pretty efficient stratagems that can affect multiple different kill teams at once, the Teleportarium is great, and the special issue ammunition is pretty punchy, particularly on certain kill teams, and then really good enhancements with the double Oath of Moment for a turn with the Tome of Ectoclades, the Beacon Angelis for the free rapid ingress and deep strike, and the Thief of Secrets for a super fighty character. They're all stand out great. Then for their units, the Indomitor kill team still seems the single most central one, as seemed likely as per the points changes. They get big hitting firepower with boosted strength, heavy hitting bolt rifles, melter weapons and flamestorm gauntlets. They can often be led by a Gravis captain to discount those efficient stratagems for them. Deathwatch veterans are also a staple, and bigger units went down a bit. They're often led by a Watchmaster or Judicer, and otherwise there often tends to be some use of either the Terminators, Fortis or Talonstrike kill teams. The Primaris ones had some points cuts that made them a bit more relevant and competitive. Then for supporting units, they can dip into the Space Marine things. Infiltrators, Intercessors, Combi Lieutenants and Incursors tend to be good for the Deathwatch, maybe with a Storm Speed or Thunderstrike to give you +1 to wound against tough targets. That's pretty powerful with special issue ammunition fire. Overall, it does look like the small number of Deathwatch players have been having a pretty good time of it recently. Several notable big tournament wins recently, including coming second at the Las Vegas Open. Perhaps the biggest issues for the army at the moment aren't necessarily strength ones. They're in their slightly odd place in Warhammer 40k, surviving through the patch without an official codex, which isn't great for their long-term support. It'd be nice if Games Workshop could take a look at the Corvus Blackstar being their unique vehicle. That's unlikely for Aircraft and 10th edition though, and they do have some rewritten rules outstanding for their new Primaris Deathwatch veterans that came out in Kill Team Tomb World. They'll probably be out in the not too distant future. Finally, and just about taking the top spot for this one, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus, also on a 58% win rate and rose up by a similar amount to the Deathwatch. That seems to be consistent both over competitive and casual games. Despite again having fairly low player counts, as Warhammer 40k goes, they've been taking the very most either grand tournaments or 5-0 undefeated runs, with no less than 13 similar top placings like that. That means they already basically win by that metric, and they get further ahead if you weight it per player number. If you do that, then it's them first, then Deathwatch. They might have slightly low player rates, at least compared with the rest of 40k, but being played 20th out of 40k's 28 factions is actually slightly higher than normal for them. I'd guess if they keep on going with these rules, they're probably going to creep up the ratings there. The last balance changes were really quite a big deal for them. The single biggest one was that Belisarius Core essentially hands out Admech style Oath of Moment, so you mark one unit and it gets deleted with some full rerolls to hit against it. It's quite a surprising faction level buff to be handed out to one character. It's essentially made him kind of auto-include in competitive lists. Otherwise, those several other datasheets got some meaningful improvements. Iron Striders getting twin-linked for the low cost of an extra 5 points, and both Roststalkers and Infiltrators got improved. Roststalkers with a now popular damage 2 profile, Infiltrators getting extra AP on an already auto-include unit, and the Honoured Dunecrawler had one of its weapons improved as well. For the detachments that they use, the Halo Screed Battleclade is the most popular. It's got quite nice general purpose support for the army, with access to things like advance and charge, and some nice ways to get some core shooting combos just extra nasty. Skitari Hunter Cohort also does rather well, with harder to kill Skitari, a 5+ feel no pain stratagem, and some movement shenanigans and return to reserves. It's not quite so general purpose at supporting the non-Skitari stuff though. Otherwise for their units, Rangers and Vanguard tend to be there in at least some numbers to hand out the boosted Doctriners nearby. They're both nice enough skirmishers in their own right as well. Anti-tank duties are often covered by somewhere between Scorpius Disintegrators and Ironstrider Bellastari with the twin-linked las cannons now. Castron Breaches are still solid, though a fair few more people are using Plasma Destroyers alongside a Manipulus. They're very nice now that Core can give them the reroll or hits. Infiltrators are nice to have moving forward to score points. Taraxi can jump around and help out with that as well, and the Cerberus Raiders are also solid for the role. And then Roststalkers often tend to be a staple in a lot of lists as well. commonly seen with big units of 10 of them rushing in with their damage to anti-infantry weapons, potentially going really quite a long way with advance and charge or staging out of transports. Overall, it seems like the Servants of the Machine God are finally having their time in the sun in 10th edition. Not too bad after having been at least kind of mid to weak for the majority of it. To me, it seems very likely they're going to continue this kind of performance and remain one of the very strongest factions in Warhammer 40k. That's probably going to wind up with some points nerfs when they get around to the next balance update, though I feel like for AdMech, anything to make them stronger and more expensive is probably ultimately a helpful thing for the army. If Core is going to continue appearing in just about every list, I'd suspect that he might go up in points a bit further. I think it always does feel odd from a balance perspective that one model just gets so utterly auto-include. As a result, if they do wind up doing points nerfs to AdMech, there's a good argument that he should probably be in the firing line. Plenty of time before that though, I'm sure the AdMech will be having a good time on the tournament scene. That's just about it for the main top 10. Here's some overall win rates since the last update. Here you can see the upper third. We've got the AdMech, Deathwatch and Aeldari taking the top spots there. Lots more in the sort of upper mid kind of running, and plenty of armies that aren't far below that, Demons and Death Guard being the next closest. Here are the high performers in terms of tournament wins since the last balance pass. We've got AdMech, Aeldari and Space Marines leading the way there, then Chaos Knights, though we'll bear in mind that play rate numbers do have an effect on this, so that the AdMech are actually even more impressive than they look, and Space Marines aren't quite as impressive as this. And then finally, here are the armies that people are most choosing to take to tournaments. This one having a few factor things, including how fun people choose to play the army, perception of relative strength, and just overall popularity of the faction right now. Compared with normal Warhammer 40k things, it feels like maybe the Blood Angels and World Eaters are higher than they'd normally be, and the Tyranids maybe a little lower, as we're seeing though several of the very strongest armies in the game are lesser played factions, Deathwatch Sisters and AdMech in particular. They do have kind of low player populations who collect the army in the first place though. That's about it for this one though. Let me know what you make of the strongest armies in 40k right now. Finally, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold and their magnetic carry cases for those interested in them, and talk through a few of their range and models. Here are the sizes for their trays. You can generally fit, if you maximally load them, you can generally fit 90 odd 25mm bases on a tray, or about 30 Terminators or 6 Knight Armigers. And then those trays go in these cases as so. They've got 3 main sizes of them. The mini one is the smallest one, £72 or $75 with the 8025 code that they gave me. That includes delivery, so shipping's included, though depending on location there might be some VAT or import duties. Then for the standard size one, they've got the regular mag case. This one £114 or $120. They all come with some magnets to mount below the bases. I'll leave the dimensions on the screen. This one's really quite a lot taller and could fit in a lot of normal sized armies here. You can see there's an entire Chaos Knight on the ground floor. They have a really big one called the Mag Case XL, which is basically 2 of the previous attached together. A whole Baneblade on the top left for this one, and should be enough room for a whole bunch of big collections. And if you're in the market for a terrain set as well, if you pick up a Mag Case, they have some terrain set bundles where the terrain is a little cheaper than it would be normally. In any case though, check them out, links down in the video description, and thanks to them for sponsoring this one. That's about it for this one. If you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the videos I make, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.